This is a video that I've been working on and off for 2 years. I hope it was worth it. Even the most captured woman guards the place of the wildish self, for she knows intuitively that someday there will be a loophole, an aperture, a chance, and she will hightail it to escape. When women's lives are in stasis or filled with ennui, it is always time for the wildish woman to emerge. The relationship between mankind and the land is one of torture, exploitation, and degradation. It may appear subtly through the construction of nice homes over sacred pastoral lands, or demonstratively through the destruction of Amazon forests for agriculture. This relationship, when examined socially, almost seems to resemble that of man and woman, of predator and prey, of conqueror and conquered. Ecofeminism of the 1970s and 80s set out to examine this parallel between the land and the socially defined woman. Pioneered by women like Carolyn Merchant in her landmark 1980 novel, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, they sought to view the scientific revolution through a feminist and ecologist lens, exploring a similitude that challenged and redefined environmentalism. Merchant argues that the landscape, the earth, was not only viewed as feminine but exploited as such. In both Western and non-Western cultures, nature was traditionally feminine. Quote, in Latin and Romance languages of medieval and early modern Europe, nature was a feminine noun, and then, like the virtues, temperance, wisdom, etc., personified as female. She continues saying that central to the organic theory was the identification of nature, especially the earth, with a nurturing mother, a kindly, beneficent female who provided for the needs of mankind in an ordered, planned universe. It is here we begin to merge theories of environmentalism and feminism, of woman and landscape as one. Merchant explores a theory in which the woman, alike the land, is viewed as a passive object to be ruled by men. Quote, but while the pastoral tradition symbolized nature as a benevolent female, it contained the implication that nature, when plowed and cultivated, could be used as a commodity and manipulated as a resource. Nature, tamed and subdued, could be transformed into a garden to provide material and spiritual food to enhance comfort and soothe the anxieties of men distraught by the demands of the urban world and the stresses of the marketplace. In Fatal Attraction, which I do not like, Dan cheats on his wife Beth while she visits the suburban countryside. She's trying to convince her Manhattanite husband to move the family there. She is an innocent and sweet housewife, an embodiment of this suburban landscape. Alex, Dan's mistress, is chaotic on the other hand, much like the city, a working woman who resides in the grimy meat district. When Dan realizes she is too unstable and that he has made a mistake, he ends their relationship and upon his wife's return, decides to become the perfect husband. He says they can immediately go visit the suburbs, and with that, we get a long shot of their car driving away from the horrible, tainted city, as luscious trees and bushes frame their departure. The camera lingers on the picturesque white picket fence and spacious front yard before entering the house they are considering buying. At the film's end, Alex's ultimate insanity is symbolized by her trespassing of their suburban home. She is a threat that has now infiltrated their pure white picket fences, the landscape operating as a boundary to be crossed and attacked. And Beth promptly forgets her husband's little infidelity in favor of saving her endangered home and family. Operating, as Merchant previously describes, a woman in landscape that comforts, nurtures, and provides well-being from the urban world and marketplace that Alex represents. However, Merchant's earlier quote explores an alternative, a direct opposition to the passive land and passive woman parallel. Quote, another opposing image of nature as female was also prevalent, wild and uncontrollable nature that could render violence, storm, droughts, and general chaos. Both were identified with the female sex and were projections of human perceptions onto the external world. It's here that we understand a gendered viewing of the pastoral versus the machine, of woman versus man, in which the woman, and therefore the feminine land, is wild and chaotic and must avoid being tamed and subdued by the modern masculine world. Writer and Jungian psychoanalyst Clarissa Pinkola Estés is a firm believer in this relationship parallel of women and land. In fact, she wrote an entire novel about it, called Women Who Run with the Wolves, Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype. This is an extremely popular novel that I'll be referencing quite a bit in this video to fully crystallize the relationship between women and nature. Estes says through her study of wolves that she began to see women's intuitive connection to the wild, saying, quote, "A woman's issues of soul cannot be treated by carving her into a more acceptable form as defined by the unconscious culture, nor can she be bent into a more intellectually acceptable shape by those who claim to be the sole bearers of consciousness. Instead, the goal must be the retrieval and succour of women's beauteous and natural psychic forms. And it is fairy tales, myths, and stories that allow us to sharpen our sight so that we can pick out and pick up the path left by the wildish nature." To put it plainly, the innermost desires of women, their struggles, their dreams, can be studied through her innate instinctual self. And it is through reconnecting with this wild woman that all women can be truly free, satisfied, creatively driven, sensual, and passionate. Wild is in departure from its modern stigmatized form of lacking control and instead embellished with the archaic meaning of living a natural life with innate integrity. In August of 2021, I had the pleasure of visiting the Briscoe Western Art Museum in San Antonio, Texas. And in it, the Ruth McLean Bowman Bowers Gallery featured the exhibit Women of the West, which featured art by and about women of color in the American West. Above one painting was a quote by writer B.M. Bauer. Born Bertha Muzzy Bauer, B.M. was the gender-neutral pseudonym she was forced by publishers to write under. She wrote over 60 Western novels, about half of which were set where she was raised in Montana. She was also a screenwriter, as her novels were frequently adapted into films, including Chip of the Flying U, her first novel published in 1906, which was adapted 4 times. She was the first woman to make a living writing Western fiction. However, it's worth mentioning that while she included several informed depictions of Native cultures, some have criticized the choppy dialogue she would write for her indigenous characters. But, alas, her quote on the museum wall read, "I love the wild, where I can ride and never meet a human being, where I can dream and daily and feast my eyes on a landscape man has not touched." So the question I'm here to answer is, how does this archetype of the wild woman emerge in cinema? How can we further understand this spiritual relationship women possess with the landscape through film? Well, when we consider films about women and their connection to the wild, we can sort of veer off into a brief discussion of how The Road offers a route for women into their wildish selves. Stephen Shore is an American photographer whose images encapsulate the banality of the landscape, the mundane beauty of rural life. But he's also written a few essays on his site, and one of them was called The Road Trip, in which he tells this story. So in 1972, I set off on my first photographic road trip, the series that is called American Surfaces. A few days after leaving New York, I realized that driving for extended periods, seeing the world pass by the windshield for hours, put me in a very clear and focused state of mind. Robert Benton, who wrote the screenplay of the great road movie Bonnie and Clyde, has spoken of discovering during his youth in Texas that a compelling aspect of long drives was that they put him in a trance state. The experience seems to me to be more attentive than a trance, but I know what he means. On road trips, I'm an explorer traveling in a bubble of familiarity, my car. There is the freedom of being able to travel in any direction I want for as long as I want. Each journey is an adventure. Our country is made for long trips. And when I hear this, about a car that grants you freedom on the road, I of course think of Thelma and Louise in their timeless blue Thunderbird. Released in 1991, it was a road movie, unlike the ones that came before it. For one, it had 2 women as its roadie heroes, driving through the desert, which leads me to the cinematic landscape this video will be tackling, the desert. Operating as this mystical realm between city and suburb, the desert, devoid of architecture, was filling in its emptiness. In a Psychology Today article, John Cline writes, "The first Christian mystics, the Desert Fathers, pursued mystical union with God. The desert was a setting ideal for bringing apart non-ordinary states of consciousness because of the isolation and harshness of the environment." Where's Moses? He wandered. For us.
Yeah, he did.
But Cline's use of the word harshness, I think, inadequately describes the phenomenon. one not so hell-bent on pain, but instead transformation. To quote Estés, "A desert is a place where life is very condensed. The roots of living things hold on to that last tier of water, and the flowers hoard its moisture by only appearing in the early morning and late afternoon. Life in the desert is small but brilliant, and most of what occurs goes on underground. This is like the lives of many women. The desert is not lush like a forest or a jungle. It is very intense and mysterious in its life forms. Many of us have lived desert lives, very small on the surface and enormous under the ground." So, what are the small surface lives of Thelma and Louise? Well, Thelma has been relegated to the role of submissive housewife, completely doting on her annoying, rude, and cheating husband. Louise is a waitress with no long-term goals and a boyfriend who won't commit. The two are dissatisfied, and it takes a painful event to raise them to the level of consciousness that will lead them to challenge these roles in life. Thelma, without getting the permission of her husband, which of course she doesn't need, accepts Louise's offers to go on a road trip to a cabin, but not before she packs her husband's gun, just in case. After a night filled with drinking and dancing, Thelma is accompanied by her new suitor Harlan so she can get some air. It is here that Harlan attempts to rape Thelma, but Louise, who was in the bathroom, soon finds this act and threatens Harlan with the gun that they packed. As Thelma and Louise walk away, Harlan gets one last word in: "I should have gone ahead and fucked her." Louise, still holding the gun, turns around and asks Harlan to repeat himself, to which he replies, "I said suck my cock." Louise's response: a fatal bullet. Louise deciding she needs to escape to Mexico because nobody will believe Thelma if she pleads self-defense, as everyone at the bar saw her dancing with Harlan, brilliantly highlighting the lack of justice and misogyny exhibited towards victims. Throughout the film, we and Thelma slowly realize that something bad and most likely related happened to Louise when she used to live in Texas. As the movie goes on, the women become more emboldened in their defiance of men trying to dominate and disrespect them. As they venture farther away from their suburban home, so too do they begin to stray from patriarchal ideas on how they are supposed to look and behave and feel. What was originally fear and panic at their circumstance becomes an opportunity for freedom, a new chance at life. And screenwriter Callie Corey perfectly encapsulates this in a beautiful scene in the desert. The script reads as follows. Exterior, moonlit desert highway. Night. They are driving through Monument Valley. The T-Bird speeds through the beautifully moonlit desert. It is almost like daylight. Montage of silhouettes of cacti, huge rock formations, desert beauty shots, etc. Corey wants the audience to immerse themselves in this landscape, taking it in before we zone in on the characters driving through it who are simultaneously immersed in the view. Interior car, POV through windshield, night. The sky is bright and expansive, and the road goes on forever. Thelma, this is so beautiful. Louise, gosh, it sure is. Thelma, I always wanted to travel, I just never got the opportunity. Louise, well, you got it now. They both look forward for another moment, and then at the same time they look at each other, each taking the other one in completely in this moment. They're saying everything to each other in this moment, but their expressions don't change and they don't say a word. Music plays on the radio. Thelma and Louise, basking in their silence, reflect on their lives and all they never did, but now might get a chance to do. The script continues. Exterior, desert, day. Montage of driving shots as Louise and Thelma drive through the intense beauty of the Arizona desert. However, in the movie, not in the script, Louise pulls the car over while Thelma is sleeping. She gets out of the car and just stares out at the landscape in silence, the camera lingering on the mountains. It is here that Louise has her wild woman moment of clarity. There is no regret, no panic, only the road ahead. Her moment of instinct in shooting Harlan has actually gifted her something. Thelma walks up to her and asks what's going on. Louise says nothing, and the two women walk back to the car together. In the script and in the film, we get this scene. When you take all of this in, it's no wonder the film ends the way that it does. It solidifies the bond between woman and wild, between freedom and the landscape. Thelma and Louise drive into their freedom, and yes, while it is painful that the patriarchy can create such despair in an outcome, to these women, their choice was never about ending anything, but instead, as Thelma puts it, to keep going, to stay on this road, in this desert, forever. It isn't a coincidence that Thelma's car, as established at the beginning of the film, does not work and sits gathering dust in her garage. It is through venturing on the open road, watching the world through a windshield, that they learn more about themselves and the world than they ever did back home. Women are lonely in the 90s. It's our new phase. This is a quote from the 1992 film Gas, Food, and Lodging, directed by Allison Anders. The film takes place in New Mexico and follows the lives of single mother Nora and her two daughters, Shade, the youngest, and Trudy, who plays the role of reckless older child. Each woman exists separately, lacking a family cohesion. The film sees Shade want to find her mother a man, while Trudy similarly focuses her attention on boys. One night, she follows her new beau Dank to the desert as he searches for rocks. When she ventures out to see the cave he is looking at, we hear one of the first positive things that Trudy says, which is, "Wow," as she looks out at the view. The two share a romantic, sensual kiss in the glowing desert cave. The first thing he does while kissing her is take her hair out of a ponytail, letting her hair loose, perfectly capturing the visual look of what it means to be wild. The two have sex that night, and Trudy admits that her first sexual experience was when multiple men raped her. The director, Allison Anders, too, was raped by multiple men at the age of 12. Trudy reveals that she has hooked up with guys before, but has never wanted to do it. Though she makes all the first moves, this time with Dank was the first time she ever really wanted it. It is here in the darkness of the desert that Trudy's walls come down, and she is her most honest and vulnerable self, reflecting on her pain and fighting through it to let herself feel joy. In Women, Wilderness, and Everyday Life, a documentation of the connection between wilderness recreation and women's everyday lives, 34 women were interviewed to discuss their relationship to the wilderness. Researchers then compiled 5 characteristics that describe the benefits of wilderness recreation. 1. Escape from norms, everyday demands, and distractions. 2. Challenge and survival, physical and mental. 3. New opportunities, learning new skills. 4. Natural awe and beauty, connection to nature. And 5. Solitude, isolation, time to focus, mental revitalization. Trudy, after experiencing the natural awe and beauty, is able to undergo this new opportunity and focus on herself. When we find out that Trudy is pregnant with Dank's child, it further crumbles the suffering family dynamic in Shade's eyes, as Trudy abandons Shade after her mother attempts to force her to get an abortion. In a confrontational argument with her mother, Shade accuses Nora of being the reason they don't have a family. The desert is often considered a lonely place in its vastness, and Shade's loneliness amplifies as the film continues. But then, she finds refuge in her new love affair with Javier and her desert town. When the two kiss for the first time, the scene dissolves into a shot of them standing atop huge rock mountains in the desert. Shade narrates their intense connection as we get shots of cactus flowers and the two cuddling among the desert grass. She says,
"And yet, when we were alone, together we made up the same person. In his arms, I knew who I was. Shade. Just Shade. And I was more than enough."
Once again, we see a young woman achieve a sense of fulfillment and peace through their relationship with the desert that acts as her backdrop, her symbolic landscape of love. And through her dialogue, we know that love is not simply for Javier, but herself, as he helps her appreciate herself more as a person. When Trudy finally has her child, Shade attempts to convince her to come back home and live with them.
Laramie's a shithole. There's nothing there.
There is something there. The desert, Trudy. It's just like you said. It's alive. It's magic. That's not nothing.
There has been a shift in Shade's perspective. She has felt and seen the beauty their home desert has to offer. But Trudy, thrust into a harsh reality, cannot buy into the magic anymore. Her pain and isolation have hardened her to the beauty she once knew, and her moving to Dallas both physically and spiritually distanced her from the desert and its influence. Women are lonely in the 90s. It's our new phase. This is a line that Allison Anders wrote for the mother Nora in the film, and this loneliness is examined through all 3 female characters. Though the film heavily focuses on their relationship with men, it would be demeaning to assume that this is all the movie cares about, as it clearly examines the loneliness these women feel amongst each other. Trudy and Nora constantly butt heads, and when Trudy moves out, Shade herself says that she and her mother don't really talk. These women struggle to communicate in healthy ways and try to fill their time with boys and men, some good, some not quite right. And what landscape so viscerally captures loneliness like the desert, in its wide vastness and open land, so misunderstood as its small surfaces present little, but offering so much underneath? In the albeit lame documentary What is Cinema, filmmaker Yvonne Rainer says the woman's body in classic cinema was a landscape through which the man passed and controlled, something temporary and in need of taming. And Gas, Food, and Lodging shows women who have been taught to believe this as if it were perpetual truth, but redefines it to say that while women can be the landscape, they themselves are the ones who are meant to explore it, and they themselves should decide who get to pass through it. I'm gonna talk about Glow now.
Yeah.
I talked about Glow before, and we'll probably talk about it forever. The television show centers around a group of women in the 1980s who form Glow. In the third season, the women pack up their failed TV show and head to Vegas to start their live show. In episode 6, titled Outward Bound, however, we finally see the ladies leave the city and head to the desert for a little retreat. It is their first time doing so. In the novel The Solace of Fierce Landscapes, exploring desert and mountain spirituality, Lane C. Belden focuses on human relationships with God and how they are influenced or idolized through the desert. She emphasizes the landscape first and the idea of noticing and identifying with one's environment. Quote, "Without a habitus, particularly one that is drawn or at least in part from the rhythm of the land around us, our habitat ceases to be a living partner in the pursuit of common wholeness. We become alienated from an environment that seems indifferent, even hostile. Habitat turns into scenery, inconsequential background. The women in Glow have completely ignored the landscape of Nevada, past its glimmering casinos and showgirls, and this episode seeks to explore this alienation and the pain it has caused in them by thrusting them into the environment they have forsaken. They come to learn the desert is no mere inconsequential background, but rather a force to be reckoned with. Spoilers for the episode ahead. The episode starts with my favorite song of all time, Gypsy by Fleetwood Mac, playing as the women drive through the desert landscape, the camera lingering on this journey and the road they are taking. We're pretty quickly introduced to the different dynamics and subplots this episode will seek to explore. Roommates Jenny and Melrose are undergoing some tension after last week's episode when everyone switched wrestling characters for the night, and Melrose played Jenny's stereotypical fortune cookie, engaging in offensive dialogue and actions, visibly upsetting Jenny. This episode centers around the transformation of characters including Ruth, Debbie, Jenny, Melrose, and finally Sheila, who has dressed up like a wolf the entire series and made it her wrestling character. However, once again in the previous episode when everyone switched roles, she surprised everyone by dressing up as a completely new character, Liza Minnelli, a huge step in her character arc. Once the hike begins, our story begins. The episode cuts back and forth between Debbie and Ruth, Melrose and Jenny, and Sheila as each of them struggle with the roles the show and Vegas as a whole has forced them into. Jenny finally vocalizes her difficulties in playing a racist stereotype, but Melrose fundamentally doesn't understand this.
Every night, I put on a kimono to jump out of a fortune cookie at an Asian-themed hotel surrounded by white geishas serving Mai Tais. It sucks.
Oh, come on. I wasn't doing an impression of you. I was doing you doing a racist character.
She doesn't really feel guilty and further upsets Jenny. Debbie rants about the freedom all the men in her life seem to have while she struggles to establish herself as a producer while still being a present mother.
Debbie Egan, 32, found dead near a cluster of rocks. A fledgling producer who never had a project of her own.
Ruth grapples with her romantic feelings, a part of her she's grown to be ashamed and scared of.
Sam told me he's in love with me.
Okay. You're gonna have to tell me how you feel about that, because I can't see your face in the dark.
We also get a few scenes of girlfriends Yolanda and Arthi, as Arthi fails to recognize the homophobia some of her teammates have and the internalized fear that she herself has, which prevents her from being able to label herself as gay.
And what if you don't know? If you're, you know. What do you mean?
Through their desert vulnerability, these women strive for, and some are able to reach, a point of clarity in which they confront their best and worst behavior and desires. The glitter and glam have been shed, and their souls are laid bare in the barest of landscapes. We watch a dehydrated and struggling Sheila languidly crawling up the mountain before spotting a white wolf as mystical music plays. She is transfixed and reaches out to the wolf, smiling and crying before Vicky turns to see she is passed out. Reminiscent of Estes' title, the wild woman is symbolically connected to running with wolves, free and primal creatures who create a mystical bond with women. This is a bond Sheila has held for a long time and has a complex relationship with. In a previous episode, she brilliantly performs a monologue that is cut short by her acting coach, who claims her appearance is too distracting and prevents her from connecting with her character. Though Sheila says this is who she is. She is both confident yet pained in this wolf persona, seemingly too vulnerable underneath to let herself be exposed. It is in this delirious moment in the desert that she truly sees her soul through the wolf and finds peace within. When Melrose's Jewish Seder over dinner leads her to reflect on the trauma her family still feels from the Holocaust, Jenny quietly joins in the conversation. She begins talking about how and why she fled Cambodia.
We got one of the last flights out on a U.S. military plane that had just dropped off all this rice. Everyone else we knew died. I understand what it's like to survive a genocide, and we'll talk about it all the time. The killing fields.
It is in this moment that Jenny's deepest pain and guilt in playing her character are fully contextualized. Melrose apologized to Jenny, and everyone hugs, supporting one another after a moment of sheer vulnerability. The pressures of cultural guilt and offense had been building in the show for quite a while through slight comments and scenes here and there. However, this is a scene that deeply centers on the generational trauma of our characters, who are frequently sidelined to support the storylines of our white main characters. Arthi even discusses how the wandering of the desert is a metaphor for the immigrant experience.
How the first generation wanders the desert, and then the promised land is for their children.
Arthi, are you secretly a Jew?
This moment of truth creates a stronger sense of community amongst the women and reaffirms the support they provide each other. The landscape has forced them into this confrontation, but led them to healing. Mary Oliver is a poet famous for her focus on nature and the wild, and one poem of hers called Wild Geese stands out to me in regards to this episode of Glow. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Oliver uses the desert to reflect on a pain that appears to be feminine, in which the desert is where we repent, walking on our knees. The women in Glow, as examined by this episode, are battling something that inherently involves their identity and the role they play in their own lives. And here they are, thrust into the desert, walking on their knees as they're forced to contemplate their mistakes and disappointments that they try to rectify and solve. Sheila, quite literally, lets the animal of her body, a wolf, find inner peace without outward expression. Each woman opens up about their pain because they're encouraged to do so by the other women in their life. But we leave the episode knowing that in order for these women to feel truly liberated, they must abandon what hurts them and allow themselves to love what they love, whether it be their culture, their true self, their job, their child, or a partner. Only then will they be like wild geese, announcing their place in the family of things. A beautiful line to express the community Glow creates among these women, none of which would have come to these discoveries without their fellow wanderers. This episode was the first episode director Anya Adams directed for the show, and she does such a beautiful job. In an interview with Gold Derby, Adams said that the first scene she shot for the episode was the scene with the real-life wolf Sheila interacts with, which, to me, funnily enough, captures the same desert magic off-screen. Here's this woman entering new territory with a new ensemble, and her first shot is one of the most spiritual scenes in the episode. And she wound up winning the 2020 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Directing in a Comedy Series. I think something I found really frustrating while making this video was how many desert women films were about white women. Even Rabbit Proof Fence, a film centered around the Aboriginal experience in Australia in 1931, was written and directed by white people, despite the fact that the book is based on a true story. The previously mentioned work, The Solace of Fire, introduces this relationship between desert and God by describing the faith of the Aboriginal people in Australia. It is Clarissa Pinkola Estés' intimate relationship with Mestiza Latina oral story traditions that gave us such a landmark novel. One very interesting work I found was this 2018 short film called The New Frontier, in which Indigenous Hawaiian director Kanani Koster sought to subvert typical Western tropes and imagery to include stories long erased. Through a series of vignettes, Koster confronts her feelings towards Western's inaccurate depiction of Indigenous women in order to create, quote, a contestation of the submissive, docile roles that Indigenous women are usually cast in. Upon my visit to the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art, there was an exhibit called Shattering the Pictures in Our Heads, a film installation that, quote, deconstructs the mythic Indian stereotype through an immersive documentary experience with genuine perspectives from members of the Shoshone Paiute tribes of the Duck Valley Indian Reservation. This film installation creates a three-dimensional audio and video environment where visitors can find themselves steeped in the sights, sounds, and powerful stories that bring to light the diverse cultural identity of the Native community. Made alongside Edge of Discovery's Deep West Film Mentorship Program, filmmakers and students from the rural West work to make short films. Directed and narrated by Kareem Orego, Destiny Max, and Lance Oweed, the documentary beautifully displays the grandeur of the mountainous landscapes of the isolated desert between Idaho and Nevada. Featuring these long, steady takes of the landscape as Native professors and community leaders openly discuss what it means to retain this sense of identity through your land and people. You can learn more about this at edgeofdiscovery.com. Ultimately, the films and shows I discuss offer so much vulnerability and tenderness in their exploration of female pain and trauma. To quote The Solace of Fierce Landscapes again, quote, embracing desert and mountain spirituality requires assuming the hazards of a rugged land, remaining open to the threat it poses. There may be no substitute for the instructive power of place. The only other heuristic aid of penetrating importance might be the simultaneous experience of loss in one's personal life. Certain truths can be learned, it seems, only as one is sufficiently emptied, frightened, or confused. Emptiness offers answers of its own. Deep speaks to deep. The desert is both a physical manifestation of challenge and change, and a spiritual arena of transformation, and it is most likely to impact the vulnerable, the pained, who otherwise ignore these troubles or run from them, and it is the works of art that place women in this space that create beauty through this pain. If you liked this video, please physically do so, as it really helps my channel. If you're not subscribed and you want to be, go for it. I'm considering starting a Patreon in a few months, so that would be great to start seeing that support now. That is the end of the video. Yeah.